Protein synthesis is arguably the most important aspect of hypertrophy. The constant theme you've probably noticed throughout this course is to maximize protein synthesis. So here it is, the secret equation of muscle growth. MPS means muscle protein synthesis minus MPB, which means muscle protein breakdown, equals your net protein balance. You have to eat right to repair your muscle tissue after crushing it in the gym. You could call that Hypertrophy 101. And this muscle tissue repair occurs via protein synthesis. The most straightforward interpretation of protein synthesis is the formation of new proteins to repair and build muscle. And while muscle protein breakdown is just as it sounds, the breakdown of proteins, basically the opposite of protein synthesis. Muscle protein breakdown is also often referred to as protein degradation or protein turnover. Now, under normal conditions, muscle has a high turnover rate. Roughly in the range of 1 to 2% of muscle proteins are being broken down daily. Now, you can see in this figure that without any training stimulus, muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown pretty much cancel each other out. After you eat, protein synthesis increases until it peaks, and then it steadily declines below protein breakdown. In this example, let's assume that the ratio of muscle protein synthesis to muscle protein breakdown is 1 to 1. So therefore, the net protein balance for the day is 0. There's no gain or no loss of protein. Now, let's add in resistance training with the right nutrient intake at the right time, and this is going to change things quite a bit. Protein synthesis is now activated and protein breakdown is suppressed. So let's say in this example, let's assume that the ratio between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown is 2 to 1. Therefore, the net protein balance is positive for the day, meaning that we've added or synthesized more protein than we've broken down. And the result is an accumulation of muscle protein over time. So, hypertrophy all comes down to maximizing muscle protein synthesis and lowering muscle protein breakdown, with the goal of achieving a positive net protein balance. So, now that we know this, what can we do to maximize protein synthesis and lower protein breakdown? Well, mTOR is currently the most important cell signaling pathway for muscle growth. It essentially is the master controller of protein synthesis, and there is a direct relationship between muscle growth and mTOR activation. The more we activate mTOR, the more the protein synthesis equipment can crank out new proteins for muscle growth. Now, there are several factors that play a role in activating mTOR. The first is training itself. The second are hormonal growth factors. The third is protein intake. And the fourth is insulin. Every time you're lifting, you will trigger mTOR. However, there are two specific muscle actions that have been shown to be more effective when it comes to optimally stimulating mTOR. The first are eccentric actions. Now, eccentric doesn't just mean slowly lowering the weight. It is much more effective if you maintain tension in the muscle while lowering the weight. Basically, maintain a mind-muscle connection and keep your muscle hard while you're lowering the weight. The second type of muscle action that will trigger mTOR is isometric holds performed at the lengthened position of an exercise. When a muscle is stretched under load, it increases mTOR activation. This is why a full range of motion is so important. One theory is that muscle damage occurs while under load via micro tears in the muscle. It's kind of like the quail ring study that we talked about when we discussed hyperplasia. Now, the second factor playing a role in mTOR activation are growth factors, specifically hormones. For example, both IGF-1 and GH are released when you produce high amounts of lactic acid. And this is why when you're training for hypertrophy, you must train in a zone where there's some lactate buildup in the muscle. Now, don't get me wrong, you can absolutely put on muscle by just simply lifting heavy without lactic acid. It's just not as effective. The third factor in activating mTOR is protein intake. And to break it down a little further, there are a few specific amino acids that have been shown to be even more effective. Protein acts synergistically with weight training to stimulate protein synthesis. But just as there's an upper limit to how much exercise we can productively recover from, there's also appears to be an upper limit to how much protein we can eat to max out protein synthesis. Finding out how much protein you require can be broken down into two really simple steps. Step 1, determine your optimal protein intake to maximize muscle protein synthesis per meal. Step 2, determine your meal frequency. It's that simple. So it's important to look at it from a meal-to-meal basis rather than a daily amount of protein, because muscle protein synthesis is regulated meal to meal, not day to day. And the optimal daily intake for hypertrophy seems to be around 1.7 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this amount should be split up between meals, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the amino acid leucine, one of the branched chain amino acids, or BCAAs, is believed to be particularly important in optimizing protein synthesis in regards to hypertrophy. It appears to activate mTOR while also downregulating muscle protein breakdown, making it a double threat. It's important to note, however, that leucine's influence on mTOR is specific to just activating it, meaning that sustained elevated protein synthesis levels for an extended duration of time heavily relies on the total protein intake. So you can't just use a small dose of leucine or leucine to maximize protein synthesis. For it to stay maximized over a period of time and to get the optimal duration out of it, you require other proteins like essential amino acids or ideally a complete protein source. And the final factor influencing mTOR is insulin. Now, I separated insulin from the other growth factor hormones because with them, the focus was more on the training effect and lactic acid production. Whereas with insulin, we're going to focus more on the impact from nutrition. When insulin goes up, mTOR is activated, which is why a sufficient caloric intake is so important. By simply consuming a large meal, it can be enough to stimulate mTOR. And it's particularly better if carbs are present because carbs increase insulin. This is one of the reasons why it's near impossible to build muscle on a low-carb diet with a caloric deficit. So if the goal is to peak mTOR stimulation, then carbohydrates around the time of training becomes essential. It has been shown consecutively in literature that insulin signaling isn't needed to turn on training-induced protein synthesis pre-workout. Just leucine is required, which suggests that carbs aren't as important pre-workout. However, insulin is also a very powerful muscle protein breakdown inhibitor. So it's still a very important tool when it comes to net protein balance and should be consumed around training for optimal growth potential. A simple rule of thumb here is the harder you train, the more you may need to lean on carbs for performance and recovery. So you may use them before, during, and after. It's going to depend more on your specific needs as an individual. So let's talk about the key points. Muscle protein synthesis minus muscle protein breakdown equals net protein balance. And this is the key to hypertrophy. Without this, it doesn't matter how much you're training or anything else. It all comes down to net protein balance being positive. So the goal is to have a positive net balance or net gain. The second thing is mTOR is currently the most important cell signaling pathway for muscle growth. So everything we do is trying to influence mTOR. So the factors that greatest influence activating mTOR are training, hormonal growth factors, protein intake, specifically amino acids, and leucine being a very powerful one, and insulin. So it's also important to note that insulin is a powerful inhibitor of muscle protein breakdown. So remember, it's still a very powerful tool when it comes to net protein balance and should be consumed around training for optimal muscle growth.